Scientific. Through the prayers of our Holy Father, the Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us. O Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who art everywhere present and fills all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us and cleanse us of all impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So we made it last week in our study of Way of the Ascetics, this little book by Tito Colliander, to about halfway through chapter 5. Chapter 5 has been the longest chapter that we've had so far. And we were speaking mainly on the denial of self. And the second half, which we're going to kind of continue with this evening, is on the cleansing of the heart. And if we make it into chapter 6, we're talking about in particular, how do we, get rid of, I think he used the word eradicate, but these little enjoyments and the desire in general for enjoyment, for what we say in Greek oftentimes, kaloperisi. We might say in English for entertainment. All of these things fall under that, and I think in our age, like none other, a focus on that, paying attention, especially in the form of entertainment, I think is particularly pertinent focus, a very practical focus for how we actually go about cleansing of the heart. But just to speak again, last week we talked about the denial of self in the beginning. We've really been talking about this from the beginning, of these chapters, from chapter 2 on. And remember, a lot about this denial of self is so that we can learn to trust God. Because the big problem we have, and he says this on the second page of chapter 2, I can't remember, or chapter 5 rather. I don't know what the page number is. The top of it, I guess it's maybe 5 here if you have the PDF, but we're at the top of the page begins, on the same foundation, our unchecked habit of satisfying only our own will. But in particular, that first paragraph on the second page of chapter 5, it says, "It is the life of our will that is destroyed. Since the fall, the will has been running errands exclusively for its own ego." And this is sort of the point. Everything we do tends towards our own ego, towards our own self at the center of the universe. In a certain way, that's natural, obviously. One, because it's our fallen nature, but two, because in a certain way, we begin with where we find ourselves. That's always in a context, obviously. First, in the context of our family, of our community, the people around us, but primarily in the context of our relationship to God. But in the fallen state that we find ourselves in, that overriding context of us in relation to God is precisely what has become so distorted for us and so difficult to perceive as human nature has become disordered. So instead of the center of ourselves looking up to God and then looking out to all of creation and to our neighbor, right? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, the first and great commandment. And then secondarily, by doing that, to be able to love your neighbor as yourself. But when we initially begin this reordering process, we find the exact reverse. We love ourselves, then possibly we love our neighbor, the people around us, and then maybe we love God. And so the purpose of the way we need to understand self-denial and the purpose of it is not to beat up on ourselves, is not to be depressed, is not to say things in this world are bad and pleasures are bad or something like that. It's precisely because we don't know how to use these pleasures properly and we let them, kind of run wild, that we have to do this self-denial of cutting back, as it were, so that with the goal of being able to partake in a proper way of all of these pleasures, and especially beginning to perceive the spiritual pleasures, which are actually the greatest desire of the human soul. But most of us don't feel that, precisely because one doesn't understand what it's like having a beautiful gourmet meal when they've been eating from the dumpster their whole lives. And so this is part of the problem where we find ourselves. So this is what we mean when we're talking about the denial of self. Not to be morbid, not for, to say everything in this world is bad or any of that kind of stuff, but precisely to reorient our love. And that's the difference between Orthodox Christian forms of ascesis or asceticism, this way of the ascetics, and usually what's attributed to Eastern religions and their kinds of asceticisms, which outwardly both look very similar. If you looked at sort of Buddhism and you looked at Orthodox monasticism from the Philokalia, in some ways exteriorly you might think those look very similar in terms of controlling your thoughts, cutting off distractions, maybe even similar kind of spiritual exercises exteriorly. But the difference is, for the Eastern religions, the idea is to suppress and to cut off desire for the purpose of removing it. Whereas for us, the purpose of cutting off desire is for the purpose of controlling it, and better yet, to use the phrase of St. Maximus the Confessor, to purify our love. So for us, the goal of asceticism is precisely so that we can follow our desires more purely, i.e. our desire for love of God. And that's not the same thing that you'll find in, generally speaking, in these sort of Eastern traditions of Buddhism or things like that. But so this is where we find ourselves, right? And this is why, in the beginning, because of our tendency to pamper ourselves, because of our tendency to trust our own thoughts, our own will, our own desires, and to put those above the desires of the people around us, or even above the desires of or the needs of what's good for us, we need to take this sort of harsh stance with ourselves that we hear Tito speaking about, and we need to be brutally honest with ourselves. That's really the only way we're going to make a change. Oftentimes, if you think of your health or something like that, it isn't until you go into the doctor's office and you have him lay it out for you straightforward. You have high blood pressure, you have high cholesterol, you have whatever problem. If you don't stop, you're smoking, you're eating these foods, you're doing this, you're going to die. You're setting yourself up for an early grave or something like that. Or, you have diabetes now. And what are you going to do? You keep going the way you are, you're going to be on insulin, and that's going to be your life. Or you can face the reality and do the hard work of putting a check on those desires, changing your habits, starting to exercise, starting to eat properly, all of those kinds of things. But often it's only being faced with this brutal reality that we actually have the incentive to make a change. And there's a lot of things wrapped up in that, fear being one of the main things, right? We hear news like that, and it's that initial fear that motivates us to want to change. This is the same in the Christian life, right? The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And Abbot Dorotheus, as we saw last year, talked about three kinds of fear. The fear of punishment. Then there's the fear of the worker who is going to lose his pay if he doesn't do it. But the ultimate fear is the fear of a son who isn't going to be worthy of the love of his father. And that's ultimately where we're going with this, right? But in the beginning, that's why we speak harshly about denying ourselves. That's why we put a check even on, as he's trying to say, desires that are blameless, like having an extra cup of coffee, like, having the second plate of food or something like that. That these things aren't sinful in and of themselves, but this is an opportunity for us to stretch ourselves, to begin to gain some mastery over our desires, and in particularly through that our thoughts, so that we can become the kind of people that ultimately we want to be, but in particular God wants us to become, and not some kind of carbon copies of some divine robots or something like that. He wants us to truly become true human beings, and that's what the saints are. The saints aren't cookie cutter, right? They're all very, very individual, and that's what's so amazing about it. They all share in the same divine life. They follow the same path of purifying their thoughts and living clean lives and becoming illumined and uniting with the grace of God to feel how they see the world and how they interact with the world, so that they became deified, so that they participated and were transformed into true human beings. And yet, despite that God is who he is, and despite the fact that this pattern, we might say, this method for achieving this is the same in the basics, the end product is very unique in each of the cases of the saints. You can see it reflected just in their icons, right? Not just how they're painted because they're real people, but what they're holding, for example, the lives they lived and how they lived that out, and all of these different kinds of things, and what their character was like. All of that is unique, and it doesn't disappear. It's the goal here is by denying these desires, these desires, we might say. The fathers will even say animals don't even have such disordered desires as we have. But by getting these things under control, we're actually removing these shackles that drag us along, that actually take away all the control in our lives. Because at the end of the day, if your stomach rumbling, causes you to lash out at the people around you, causes you to get in an argument, or causes these kinds of problems, what does that say about us, right? About how problematic that is. Do we want to live this kind of existence where we have no control over ourselves? So this is why we practice self-denial. This is why we're brutally honest with our condition. This is why we turn to Christ and the spiritual life in general, and the path that the saints have walked, and the means that are given to us within the church, so that we can break these chains. And as we talked about last week, we give over our freedom, though we freely do it, so that we can become truly free, so that we can become free of being slaves to our desires that pull us here and there, that we can't control, and that cause all these problems in our lives, that create all these anxieties and make all of these difficulties. So this is the goal. So this is why it brings us to this line, I believe that Nico really liked last week. This is self-persecution. In this way, does one silence, with God's help, one's loud voice will, right? Because ultimately tied to the ego, tied to the self-centeredness, is our own will, right? Our own willfulness, we might say. And we don't deny the will, but we want to transform that will, and by bringing it into accord with the divine will, with the will of God, which is a will that seeks perfectly the good of all creation and of all people. So that's what this self-persecution is about. That's why we want to sort of strive to do this, so that we can make space to hear God speaking to you and to me. Oftentimes we think it's so difficult to hear the will of God. It's so difficult for me to know what to do. All these things seem so external to me. But the reality of why that is precisely because we aren't doing this invisible warfare so much of the time. We're not interiorly tending the garden of our heart. And so it's very difficult for us to hear the voice of God, because the way we learn to hear his voice is by acting as he acted, by living as he lived, and by clearing space in our heart. So we hear him with the confidence that the saints have ultimately. So anyway, this is sort of where we are. But we're moving into the rest of this chapter. And so he puts this question before us. He says, you're perhaps wondering, is this really necessary? I think this is what happens to so much of us, right? I really need to do this stuff. I mean, God's a merciful God, right? Isn't everything just going to be okay? And God is a merciful God, and he wills all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth, as the scriptures teach us. The difficulty, though, with our own ego, with our own will, with not doing this, is that when we let the weeds take over within our heart, when we become slaves to our sinful desires, when we put our will into becoming slaves to these things, one would say it's probably impossible, but it's certainly very difficult to make that shift to say, I will you, God. I love you, God. I want to become like you, God, which is the road to salvation. Because in reality, what we're saying by all of our actions, by all of our thoughts, by everything we do is, I don't want you, God. I want me. That's what I want, is me. And, who chose themselves above God? Who was the first person to choose themselves above God? Well, it was Satan, right? He's the model of choosing the self over God. And the choice he made was a good one, because his own nature was good, right? Just like when we choose ourselves, we're not necessarily choosing something evil in and of itself, but what we see is any good thing cut off from God becomes twisted, becomes darkened, and takes on this character of evil. Evil in and of itself is nothing. All evil is the perversion of good. When you try to remove God out of it, everything starts to fall apart. And so that's why, despite the fact that it's easy to wonder, is this really necessary, as Tito says, he goes on to say, the Holy Fathers reply with another question. And this, again, puts it in an image for us, but clearly, I hope. Do you really think that you can fill a jar with clean water before the old dirty water has been emptied out? Or do you wish to receive a beloved guest in a room crammed with old trash and junk? No, he who hopes to see the Lord as he is purifies himself, says the Apostle John. And we might say this is the most sort of basic thing, because if God is light, how can he come to dwell in a place of darkness? How is it possible to invite him in there, into a place of darkness? And the whole point is we have to make room. We have to clean out all of the garbage to be capable of, precisely because we have free will. Precisely because in order to love, we need to choose. That's what true love is. It involves choice. Otherwise, we're just robots, right? No free will, no choice, no love, which is why we have it. And one of the marks of us showing that we want God to come in is precisely the house up. We clean the room up so that he has room to come in, right? If you had invited a guest over for the weekend or the week or something like that, and you didn't clean up the house, you didn't make room in the spare bedroom, you had boxes all over the place, you had dirt everywhere, you didn't clean any extra towels or laundry for them, you didn't fill up the cupboards with any food, you didn't do any of these kinds of things. When the guests showed up to the house, could they possibly believe that you really want them to come in? Because we haven't done anything that reflects that reality. And it's the same in the spiritual life. And this is why we need to clean out our heart. It's a very practical reality. It isn't just some airy-fairy theological kind of point of, theoretically we should become good people or something like that. No, we're literally talking about a practical necessity in order to receive God. Us beginning to make room in our hearts, us doing this purification, us turning away from our selfishness, us trying to make a beginning, all of these things are a practical demonstration that we choose God, that we choose Christ, and that we're asking him to come and dwell within us and transform our lives. If we don't do that, if we don't continue and persist in that, how can we honestly say that we're doing this? And so this is why they say it's necessary. This is why the Fathers speak this way. And so Tito says, so let us purify our heart. Let us throw out all the dusty trash that is stored there. Let us scrub the dirty floor, wash the windows and open them, in order that light and air may come into the room we are preparing as a sanctuary for the Lord. Let us put on clean garments, so that the old musty smells may not cling to us, and we find ourselves thrust out. And so this is just another image, this cleaning of the house. It's another image of tending the garden of the heart, right? The Fathers use these images, the other one too that I've already used many times with you, and that the Church uses of health, right? Of visiting the doctor and receiving the medicine and getting healthy and well. All of these images are being used because they express to us in very real, concrete terms the practical nature of what it is we need to do, and that it is necessary. We understand that if we don't go to the doctor and take the right medicines or change our lifestyle or something like that, that we can't expect to be healthy. We get that with physical things. This is why it's so useful to apply to spiritual things as well. When we talk about a garden being overrun with weeds if we don't tend it, we get that. We understand that you need to cultivate it. If you want the yard to look nice, you got to cut the grass. Simple as that. And when you leave it go, what happens? It grows up. It looks terrible, right? There's weeds. There's all these problems. That's practical. We get that. And it's the same with cleaning the house and preparing for a guest. We get that because we do it. We understand it. But we need to take that and translate it to the spiritual life, because the spiritual is just as practical as that. There are those same kinds of steps that are required. And the Fathers, in using these particular images that we've talked about, have said these images best represent it. The faith of Orthodox Christianity is not a faith about up here. Yes, we assent to these things, but not for no reason. Not so that we have the best ideas out there. Ideas not put into practice mean nothing. Very little anyway. Because it's in putting them into practice that we actually fulfill those ideas themselves, which the faith of Orthodox Christianity is a faith that tells us we need to do. It says we need to become like Christ. We need to love, which is an action. We need to love God with everything. We need to love our neighbor. We need to learn how to be able to do it. Right? It's a faith that requires action. It's not okay for us to just sit back and say, well, I know the creed. Knowing the creed is the first step. I don't know if I've quoted this to you or not, but St. Gregory Palamas says very clearly that knowing God and knowing about God is not the same as meeting Him. The goal of our life is to meet God, not just to know things about Him, not just to hold the right faith up here and never actually translate it into action. If we do that, and we only hold it up here, first of all, we won't be able to, because you can't actually understand a lot of the things that we're talking about if you don't actually go out and try to do it. Most of these things, we don't even understand what they mean until we begin wrestling with it. I say control your thoughts. But what does that mean to a person who's never even thought about that idea? It's not until you start to struggle, not until you start to put some of these things stumblingly into practice that you start to see, this is how this works. Oh, okay, here's where the temptations are, or here where the difficulties will come. And practically begin to learn, what does it mean to love the way Christ loved? What does it mean to lay down my life for my brother? What does it mean to sacrifice? All of these things require action to do them. And that's what we're talking about also with purifying our heart, right? It's a practical, not only demonstration of love, but it's a practical means of doing all of these things. And that's why it's being put before us right at the beginning. So the denial of self, not for no purpose, but so that we can become pure, that we can learn to love, that we can transform our lives and the lives of the people around us. But all of this requires, as Tito says, daily and hourly travail, meaning we got to keep up on it, right? We got to keep going. We got to keep going. But as I've said to you many times, the wonderful thing about this is in the little things, right? So when we take care of the little things, they don't develop into big things. When we take care of the little things, we gain the necessary experience that we need in order to deal with the big things when they come. And those big things suddenly seem very manageable because we know how to break down dealing with them because we've been practicing this. But at the same time, just like with the garden, it's very simple to go out into the garden once a day and pull up any of the new weeds that come. It's simple. There's hardly any, and they're really easy to pluck out. Go away for 2 months to Greece and come back, not having tended anything, and then see how much time it's going to take to pull out those same weeds, to get everything back in order, right? Then we can kind of see in a practical way, I think, why. And it's even more so with the spiritual life. If we're not committing ourselves to trying to think clean thoughts and get rid of filthy ones, of trying to keep our minds from constantly wandering here and there with no focus, as opposed to trying to center them in on God throughout the day, remembering God, or on the task in front of us, rather than the 50 different things we would rather be doing, or on something even more wonderful like the Jesus prayer as we go along throughout our day. If we don't do that, we won't have the foundation to be able to proceed. And what we'll feel is we'll feel ourselves wrung out, we'll feel ourselves stretched in unhealthy ways, and we'll find that the daily temptations that come our way, which are meant to be means for us to become spiritually healthy and strong, are actually going to be like darts being thrown at us constantly that are just continuing to sort of pelt us, rather than being a means of us moving forward. So if we neglect the daily grind, then we can't help but feel more overwhelmed, both by the little things and completely unprepared when the real difficulties come in our life, where we really need to hold on to something, where we really, where relationships start to fall apart, and where we struggle in our work life, or professional life, or with even with going to church, or all of these kinds of things. So it's very practical. Do it when it's small, and it will be easier, and you'll be trained up to be able to sort of move forward. And that's why the cleaning of the heart is so important. That's why tending the garden is so important, because it has such practical dimension. Because the other side of this is, again, as Tito quotes to us a little further down, right? The reason why we have to control our thoughts, and that's why we begin there, mainly, right? Get rid of sinful thoughts. Get rid of angry thoughts. Get rid of thoughts of judgment against other people. Try to fill those in with positive things, but even better, try to move to the point where, you're not being bombarded with any thoughts. You focus on what's in front of you, and in those moments in between, you focus on God. Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy. You're saying things like that for Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. You're filling up those empty spaces in between the tasks that are set before you with the name of God. And by doing that kind of that practicing that over and over and over, you'll see the kind of control you'll get. You'll see the kind of focus you develop, and you won't be torn here and there with all these distractions. The purpose of that is, as Tito said, to bring it back. For within us, he's quoting Christ, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornication, murder, theft, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. all of these evil things come from within and defile the man. And he says, therefore he also exalts the Pharisees. Cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. And so, again, you see, it's in this interior warfare with our thoughts, what the fathers call watchfulness. By beginning to pay attention to your thoughts, you will find yourself able to resist when temptation comes. You'll see that if you begin to control your thoughts, you won't even get into the situation in the first place. Because if you cut it off when it's a thought, you'll never turn it into action. Because it begins there and proceeds to action. It begins with your blood starting to boil, and then you turn around and smack somebody. Or then you turn around and lose your temper and yell at someone. But if you can stop it at the moment that the thought comes and just push it right away and get good at doing that, you'll never get to the point where you carry these things out in action. Okay? And this is what is being said to us. But when we don't do this kind of watchfulness of our thoughts, it leaks into our heart, it poisons our heart, and these wicked kind of desires, as it says here, all of these different kinds of evil thoughts that proceed from the heart, what happens is these things drip into this poison drips into our heart when we don't control our thoughts, and it starts to take root there. That's what the passions are. And so the next thing we know, we see these things coming out, all over. Nico, I see you with the microphone. Are you?
I was going to ask you, is it appropriate to ask a question, or do you prefer to wait?
No, go ahead, yeah.
What's coming to my mind is, on the one side, to be watchful, but at the same time, sometimes, especially with, I think, our generation, is we tend to times to also avoid difficulties, meaning instead of working on my passions, I'll just certain situations and I don't have to bother. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not saying there aren't good things to avoid. Of course, if there's, bad company, corrupts good morals, or whatever, how it goes, right? Sure. Outside of that, but I mean, sometimes I think we avoid, for example, encumbering upon certain responsibilities, say, okay, well, I just won't bother then. I won't clean the house and then I have to worry about it. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I'm a little bit concerned that sometimes we read or hear these spiritual things, but instead of applying them to our vices in the positive sense, we apply them in the negative sense where we continue with those vices.
Right.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. So the whole issue of avoiding temptation is sometimes actually just avoiding the opportunity for growth. And avoiding temptation sometimes is actually just avoiding taking up our cross and following Christ. And so I think this is it, and it's a very important point. The best way that you're going to be able to figure that out is by beginning to become a person of prayer. Because the reality is, it takes discernment to decide, am I supposed to do something here? Is this a cross I'm supposed to pick up and carry? Or is this not really my responsibility, and I should continue to do what I'm supposed to do? That mainly takes discernment. And even in the moment, which is something where a lot of these things happen, right? It's kind of a split decision kind of thing. If we get into the habit of turning our thoughts and shooting these kind of arrow prayers, I think they're often referred to God. Lord have mercy on me, enlighten my darkness, illumine my darkness, as St. Gregory Palamas used to say. Things like that, even in the moment, turning with humility and prayer to God, that sometimes can be enough to get an immediate answer from God about what should I do in a very particular situation. And the fact is, if we're not willing to do that, the habit of doing that, when we have these difficult decisions put before us and we don't want to, that's a really good indication in and of itself that we're actually avoiding temptations, avoiding taking up our cross when we ought to be. Anyway, I don't want to go off too much down the rabbit hole, but that's the most practical way I would say, is begin to cultivate in these situations, asking God, what should I do? Elder Joseph, St. Silouan, the Athonite, they both talk in a similar way about the way in which you can take a moment, step back, try to push out your desires in a situation, say the Jesus prayer a few times, and the first thought that comes into your heart, into your mind, into your heart, that pops there, do it. take it as though God spoke to you and do it. Now, that's okay with small things, especially in situations where you need to react immediately. But you want to combine that with getting advice from your spiritual father in general and with living a spiritual life that'll keep you sort of on the right path. But the fact of the matter is, God loves us. He wants us to do what's right. He wants to help us to do what's right. That's the whole point here. He understands where we are, that this is difficult for us. Like I told you in chapter 2, that's what the whole self-denial stuff is about, recognizing how weak we are and turning to Christ. He wants us to do this. He's there and promises he's going to help us to do it. We need to ask, we need to cultivate, and we need to believe he will do it. And so that's sort of what I would say is one way, is the main way to figure out, do I pick up my cross or do I walk away from this situation, is beginning to develop a real practical relationship with God in prayer, to ask what to do, and then be confident in doing it. And again, in the larger situations, you're going to go to your spiritual father. And even in some of these smaller ones, you're going to say, I prayed, this is what I thought I should do. Was I right or wrong? Or here was the outcome of that. And in humility, bring that before your spiritual father. And the more you do that, the more insight you'll gain. The more the Holy Spirit will inspire you to do it in the right way, and the easier it will be. So the main thing is, all of this stuff is about beginning to look inside of ourselves. What are our motivations? What's going on inside of me? Which part is ruling me? The part that is sort of saying, I probably should do this, but I don't want to, and I'm just going to not do it. Begin to pay attention to yourself and the way you think and the way you act inside of yourself. It'll allow you to, as I say, control your thoughts more, cut off evil desires, but it'll give you insight into, should I do something or shouldn't I? Am I avoiding this because I'm lazy, because I don't want to do something I should? Or am I avoiding this because it's not my responsibility to stand up and do something in this situation? Because oftentimes we're really good at, I have to tell this person the right thing to do. They need to know it right now, and I got to be the one to do it. We're really good at that one. We're not so good at picking up the cross of silence when someone says something insulting to us, or something that we can't help but think is rather stupid. And maybe what we're being asked to do is take up that cross of closing our mouth and accepting what that person just said. So again, combine it with prayer and these short prayers. Just say, illumine my darkness, O Christ. In that moment, pause and then do. And the more we do that, the more we bring God into it, the more we push temptation out. So I don't know, that would be, I would say, the most practical way to begin, because you'll begin to learn discernment. There's no one answer in every situation. It's impossible.
No, for sure. I appreciate that, because we need to have our bearings straight. And very quickly, one thing comes to my mind is, for example, the state of our churches now. The older generation is passing on, and now the new generation who's reaping the benefits, but don't realize, in order for these churches to be there, somebody has to clean it, somebody has to pay for the priest. Like and that's a fear that I have. Again, everything's in God's hands, of course, but on a human realm, is for this generation to wake up and say, well, you know what, these things just didn't fall from Mars. People, the old generation, maybe not as educated, quote unquote, maybe knows better, quote unquote, but look what we don't have that sacrificial spirit, as least from what we see, unfortunately, from our generation, is the spirit of entitlement instead of the spirit of sacrifice. So that's another angle but I don't want to go further. That's just a quick thought.
Yeah. So I mean, if we see these things, there's a need, and we can fill it, we ought to. Now especially when it comes to these little things like cleaning or out with certain things. Those are the kinds of things, we should be the first person to volunteer. Just like if your neighbor is, the older man down the road needs his driveway shoveled, well, guess what? You just go do it, right? You don't wait for somebody else to go do it. If you have the time, even if you're tired, even if you don't really feel like it, you know what? Go and help out. The same in the church. It becomes a little bit more complicated maybe if we're talking about, well, should I join the council or these kinds of things. In those cases, because there's more responsibility, two, there's more wrapped up in it in terms of temptations or difficulties, and three, it can be very difficult to sort of figure, do I have time for something like this? that just requires probably more guidance from a spiritual father, more time spent in prayer. Basically, the bigger the task, the bigger the responsibility, the more prayer and discerning, whether or not we should do it. But the fact of the matter is exactly, these churches, they don't stay open by themselves. If we don't reach into our pocket, for example, and lay out some money, if we don't go in there and do the cleaning or do the cooking or fill the oil in the lamp or, do the vacuuming, like there's so many things that go into it. And the fact of the matter is, yeah, a lot of us don't think about that. We have a hard enough time getting there and we leave, at the first minute. Like, who wipes down the icons, for example? Have you ever thought of that? Who buys the candles? Who orders them? Who cleans the candle stands afterwards? Who polishes all of the things we have? Who wipes down if you have pews in your right? Like, these are all practical things, but we often don't ask ourselves that, and they get left to who? The priest? Is that what you're paying your priest to do? To sweep the floor of the church? When there's so much need out there, so many different kinds of things. Certainly the apostles didn't think it was fitting to spend their time waiting on tables rather than doing the work of their ministry. But again, this is sort of practical stuff where we need to, again, look deep within ourselves and say, am I avoiding this because I'm lazy and because I don't want to commit to something? Or am I avoiding this because realistically this isn't the best thing in my particular situation and I'm going to try to find some other way? The fact of the matter is, you don't need to clean your church if you give enough money so that they can afford to pay for someone to do it, right? But if we're neither going to be willing to do it ourselves, nor are we willing to reach into our pocket to make it possible for somebody else to do it, like, we just have to think realistically. We always think about making our car payments, our bill payments, our cell phone payments, our home payments, all of these kinds of things. We would never think about missing those. But so often we don't actually ask, how are the bills being paid at the church? We would never put the dirty tablecloth in our house or the dusty old curtains, but do we put the church first in the same way that we put our appearance of our homes and our double mortgages and our cars and everything else, right? So it is something we should challenge ourselves with, I guess, to just say, God, lead me in the right way. Give me discernment to know, should I do something here? Should I make an extra donation? Should I give some more time? That kind of stuff. So but it all comes with discernment. Keep going. Okay. So we were, just him talking about it coming from the thoughts, coming from the interior, right? And this kind of cleaning out, because when we don't, if we just let things sit, they go bad. I mean, the spiritual life is like food in the fridge. If you don't eat it and you just let it sit there, more like food on the counter. If you don't eat it and you just let it sit there, it goes bad. It doesn't stay the same, and it certainly doesn't get better, right? Which is why I told you last week, there's no such thing as taking a vacation from the spiritual life. To not keep walking forward is necessarily to lose ground, is necessarily to go backwards, right? Because there's only two choices. There's towards God, or there's not towards God, which is usually towards ourselves, and sometimes towards the demons in hell. This is practical. You know this in your everyday life. You don't do the work in front of you, it piles up. It doesn't go away, right? And it's the same with the spiritual life. It's very practical. But we need not become overwhelmed. It's just one step at a time. That's all God expects from us, right? But as Tito says again in this chapter, I think I noted a little bit earlier, he says, go to it. Don't put it off, right? Just get started and make a beginning. Because part of the biggest problem is we dream big, but we put those dreams into practice very little. And this is what's being put before us. So dream smaller, precisely so that you can accomplish these things, so that God can make of you what he wants to, which at the end of the day is a saint. Realistically speaking, whether anyone ever paints an icon of you, it's not the point. The point is to be a person who lives fully a clean life in the presence of God, and who in all of their actions is loving God, but manifesting that love to people around them. Even if that means, standing up and saying a harsh word, or even if it means telling someone, no, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, or whatever. It doesn't mean, love does not mean I'm a lovey-dovey person who talks softly and just hugs people, right? That's not love. If there's any parents that are there among you, you'll know that love comes in many different forms. And that's the same with us. So he says, as we now follow instructions to begin with the inside, we must keep in mind that we're not in the least cleansing our heart for our own sake. It is not for our own enjoyment that we furbish and tidy the guest chamber, but in order that the guest may enjoy it. Will he find it pleasant, we ask ourselves. Will he stay? Our every thought is for him. What Tito is pointing out here is that ultimately, the real thing that we want to motivate why we transform ourselves is because it would be pleasing to God. Because it would be a fitting offering to the God who loved us to such a degree that he was made a complete fool of, that he was mocked, that he was tortured, that he was beaten, and that he was nailed onto a tree to sit there naked in front of the crowds of people and bleed out his life for our sake, when he could have blinked and annihilated the entire universe. He could have blinked. He didn't even need to blink. He could have just fought and wiped it all out. You imagine that kind of power and the self-emptying that went on in order for our love, in order to make it possible for us to return to him in love. That's why we do this, right? Do we experience benefit from it? Yes, of course we do. In the beginning of this struggle, as Abba Dorothea says, do we do it for that reason? No, because we're not particularly strong enough to do it. That may inspire us a little bit, but in the beginning, what inspires us most is, I don't want to go to hell. It's as embarrassing as that is, in light of who Christ is and what he sacrificed for us and the love that he's shown us. Yeah, it's embarrassing that the only reason I do this is because I'm afraid to get in trouble, right? It's embarrassing, even at the next stage, that I only do it because I want to get good things. I want to become a perfect person. I want to receive heaven. I want to have a blessed life. I want. Still embarrassing, right? We want to get to the point where we do this as sons who love their parents because the parents have poured out love, and that the children want to become worthy of that love, want to become like their parents because they respect them and they love them. And how much more is this the case? If we feel this towards earthly parents, how much more so in the case of Christ and in the situation, in the reality of what this situation is. That's what he's putting before. And so that's what we need to put before ourselves more and more, right? We're doing this out of love for another person, not because it's only about us and it only matters to us, right? We need to begin to look outside of ourselves, of stepping on that ego a little so that it's possible to bring Christ into our lives so that we can bring all of the people around us into our lives and into our hearts as well, and basically learn to love. And so he'll talk about there being kinds of nature in man. This is scriptural. St. Paul talks about the same thing. He quotes it from Nikitas Stasatos. This is basically what I've just kind of said to you. He talks about the carnal man, the natural man, and the spiritual man. This is another version of saying the person who fears hell, the person who wants his salary, and the son who wants to be sort of worthy of their father, right? And so he says, the first is lower than human nature. This is when we act like animals, basically, where, you know, we something occurs to us and we just react. We have a desire, let's go out and get it, right? We have a thought, well, let's just let it take over what we're doing right now. We have a desire for, you know, we're hungry, let's just go and do it, right? Without any kind of thought. This is the carnal person, right? And we want to move beyond that. This is the person, he says, who lives for their own pleasure, even if it harms the people around them, even if it harms others. The natural man, he says, this is sort of the next stage, is we're sort of progressing in the cleaning of ourselves, in the purifying of ourselves. So first we want to get that carnal man under control. Start to turn away from that, right? Become the natural man who wants, it says, to please both himself and others. So this is a step in the right direction, right? Start not being so selfish with our own ego, right? And we start thinking about the needs of the other people around us a little bit, okay? We're sort of in this middle place. We still want to get something, but at the same time, we're moving towards wanting to do it in a selfless kind of way for the sake of love. But then the sort of perfect man, the final place, right, is the spiritual man who wants to please only God. And the catch here is even if it harms himself, even if he has to make sacrifices, let's say, this person is willing to do that for the sake of the love of God, for the sake of the love of his neighbor and even of his enemies, right? This is the true mark of love, is and of being a Christian, is how do we love our enemies? So, you know, that's sort of what we're being called to. And so the spiritual man, he says, thinks spiritually. His hope is sometime to hear the angel's joy over one sinner that repenteth, right? We want to become like sons and daughters of God who live for the love of God. That's what meditation is about. That's what the self-denial is about. That's what changing our habits is about, right? That's why we're talking about cutting off sinful desires. Not because these things are just, oh, God is a killjoy, right? Oh, Christianity, oh, the church, it always wants more and more from me, right? We have to grow up in the way we think about these things, right? And see that, no, in the same way, again, with parents, you know, the child is being taught to read, and he only experiences as, why are my parents so mean? Why do I have to do these stupid things? Why? And only sees the moment, only sees it like a child. That's how we are with the spiritual life so much of the time. We're trying to get to the point to see it like an adult. You put in the hard work precisely because the good thing that comes from that is so good that the hard work doesn't even compare, right? And this is what we're talking about, learning to love, learning to become transformed, learning to move away from all of the dark places in ourselves and in our lives to this light of transformation. So he says, therefore, give yourself no rest, allow yourself no peace, until you have slain that part within you that belongs to your carnal nature. What he's saying again is he's using this really rough, brutally honest language to say, look, if you want to make a beginning, take control of your life, right? By giving it over to God. By saying, God, I want you to transform me. God, I want you to clean me, even if it's difficult. I want you to clean the wounds of my soul, of my thinking, of the way I relate to the people around me, so that I am capable of becoming healthy, so that I am capable of being transformed and of learning to love as you are. He just puts, I'm going to stop it here, but this final note on this chapter. But if you're fearful of becoming self-righteous, from working for your own salvation, or afraid of being overcome by spiritual pride, right? Because this is sometimes the temptation. Oh, well, I don't want to become a theosa. Oh, I don't want to become holier than thou and have people, start talking about me that way. So maybe I better not do these things, because God forbid I challenge the status quo of the way my life is and the situation with my family and friends, because it might, I might become self-righteous, is what he says. But he basically says you shouldn't be afraid of becoming self-righteous. He says if that's our fear, then we suffer from blindness, because he says such a person who is afraid of that does not already see how self-righteous he is. The whole point being, we already are these things. We already tend towards being selfish. We already tend towards putting our needs before the needs of the people around us. And unless we're really stretched, to do the right thing, we already find ourselves in the muck. The only responsible thing, the only human thing to do is to want to get up out of that mud puddle and start to clean ourselves off. That's all God is calling us to do. And He'll be there to make it possible. It starts with the small things. We have 100 chances every day. Yes, we make mistakes. We just get right back up from them and we keep going and help us progress. So we'll sort of hold it there. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to do my best.
It looks like we're good, Papa. If you want to go to the next chapter.
Okay. I'm probably just going to hold it there. I mean, we're at 7:35 now.
Okay. Oh, never mind.
Yeah, unless I'm disappointing you a great deal.
No, not at all. No, not at all.
Again, this is a small work. Realistically, we could cover, 5 chapters a night easily in terms of the amount of reading it is. But I think it's a useful activity for us to do a very close reading of these things, take our time, and go each week and try to actually put into practice what it is that we've read. So go back through these 5 chapters, see what the main point is. It's very straightforward, right? Revisit it with the purpose, with the goal of actually trying to do it. And then make a report card, as it were, of how you did that week, right? You have these 5 chapters. Go and do them this week. Do one of them each day. Let's say you're going to focus on one and take stock at the end of the day. How did I do? And, again, all for the purpose of starting to look inside of yourself and becoming aware of who you are and how you think and how temptation unfolds in your life and how you respond to it, so that you can become more equipped, more practiced, and you can learn to become victorious more and more. That's the goal. But we can read this stuff and I can talk to you for hours about it, but if you don't go do anything with it, again, it's the same as holding the faith up here. It's not going to do much for us, right? We need to actually go and put these things into practice, get some experience, come back with your questions to say, you know what, I found this really impractical, or I tried this, it didn't really work this way or that way, or whatever, and really kind of dig down with it.
I just have a quick question.
Sure.
I was just wondering who C.S. Lewis is and why we use him as a reference, because I've been told that he's not Orthodox.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis was sort of a famous Christian writer, you might say. He was an Anglican. I believe, taught at Oxford. And he is very famously known for writing books that we might say, one of his most famous books is called Mere Christianity. The basics of Christianity or something like that is what he would have how he would have put it. In addition, he's famous for writing Chronicles of Narnia. For those of you who may have read these kinds of books as children or something like that, which he depicts as the main character as a Christ figure, and sort of presents all of that. A lot of people quote C.S. Lewis because they're converts to Orthodoxy, and C.S. Lewis was fairly formative for a lot of those people. That's often why. But beyond that, he had a deep insight actually into Christianity, and he had a very good way with words, and had a good way of being able to penetrate and give good examples for presenting these things. Now, from an Orthodox perspective, there are obvious problems with his works, I think, that we would find difficult, possibly, definitely. But in general, maybe precisely because he tried not to be confessional, in confessional meaning, dedicated to Anglicanism or that kind of presentation, but because he tried to walk a more middle path or something, he was able to avoid more of the errors these other traditions, something like that. Yeah, he's a good writer. I think that's one of the main reasons. And he was a person who tried to live the faith that he knew. I know. I think it was a PhD done at the University of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki by an American student on, I think it was deification in the works of C.S. Lewis, and kind of presenting some of these themes that end up emerging, from his works, and to what degree they were knowingly, or to what degree were they because he tried to present the fathers and the history of the church in an authentic way, and it just happened to come out as a natural sort of consequence. So that's why. But he said some very insightful things on suffering, on the demons, on Christianity in general. So I think that's why. But I mean, yeah, to a certain extent, we ask ourselves, why quote non-Orthodox sources when we can quote the fathers of the church, the saints of the church? By and large, I think, there can be a tendency to quote too much from non-Orthodox authors when we have very good Orthodox saints that we could sort of reference. But sometimes it's more approachable for people, especially for non-Orthodox, and it's practicing, I think, what Saint Silouan said. Sorry, I won't go on much longer. Saint Silouan once had a priest come to him who was a missionary. I think it was a priest, a missionary, and he said to him, "How do you go about, preaching to these people that are not Orthodox?" And he said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but basically he said he goes in and he tells them all of the things that they're doing that's wrong, and then tells them how they should be doing it properly. And he said, St. Silouan was of the opinion that this is the exact way about these things. Because he says what will happen is, if you go in and you say everything you're doing is wrong, these people will automatically reject you, because he says there's elements in what they're doing that, even though it's a distortion, there's elements of truth that is actually still there. And when you tell a person that everything they're doing is wrong, their own soul will react to that, because they'll have experienced the truth in what they were doing, even if it was a distorted form, and they can't help but reject what you're saying. So he said, but if you go in and you affirm the positive things that they have, and you build from there to correct them, then you affirm what's true and what their own souls perceive to be true, so that you can then correct them. It's a means of sort of correcting with honey, as opposed to with the rod or something like that. So that's partly why I think C.S. Lewis gets used. Was there a second question there? I'm sorry.
Father Mother, going back to chapter 5, and if I can sort of paraphrase the meaning of it, it looks like our will is perverted, meaning we think that we're going to be quote unquote satisfying ourselves, but in satisfying ourselves, we don't satisfy ourselves. Meaning that we don't find our true self in satisfying ourselves. And I'm just trying to figure out, with our parents' generation, so one generation back, if you look at statistics as one example, divorce rates and whatnot, a generation ago, those stats were a lot lower than they are today. But does that necessarily mean that their will was more sacrificial exclusively? Is it also possible that a lot of times they just did it because of other pressures, or they were just quiet because, well, I'll just suffer through it, but I don't like it anyways? And the reason I'm mentioning is sometimes, our generation may be quiet, but we're not a peaceful quiet. We're actually having all the murmurings from within, but we're not expressing it, but the passion is still there. So I just wonder if you could speak to that, because I think it's, at least for myself, this is a really big topic about the will and the crushing of the will and doing God's will, and the good examples you mentioned earlier with parent and child, that the parent is very pleased when the child is doing what it needs to be doing, because then it finds its true self. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So with sort of looking at past generations or something like that, we do have to look at the sort of cultural climate or factor that in many cases, those people were just following the conventions of their world in the day. And that's why they did, just like today, people follow the conventions of the world. The difference is that those conventions have shifted and have moved further and further away from Christ in many ways. But we would say, yeah, there's no more virtue necessarily in the actions of the people. So, for example, a person who just followed the status quo 50 or 100 years ago isn't necessarily more virtuous for doing that than the person today who does the same thing. The one just happened to be led into virtue. The other one just happens to be led into vice. That just being swept along the tide of, what people are doing, that in and of itself is not, one is not more virtuous than the other. They're both problematic in their own way. Now, the reality is the conditions of our world 50 or 100 years ago were still more conducive, so that even if you were letting yourself be, swept away, you were probably being swept in the right direction. So you went to church, you did these things, and so you were still able to come in contact with these good things, with the hope that eventually your own will would respond, and you would do these things because they were good, not just because everyone does them. That's what we would hope with today. The problem is when we allow ourselves to be swept along, we're not necessarily being swept into these occasions for encountering the good, for encountering grace, for encountering things that can begin to transform our passive will of just letting ourselves be carried along into something that is more intentional and active, and is actually a chosen movement towards God. So that's sort of my first comment to that. We have to be careful when we just sort of say, well, people were generally better back then. Well, no, the conditions were more conducive. The people weren't necessarily better. You'd have to look at individual case by case. The way they acted. Additionally, we have to remember that one of the main reasons we're called not to judge people is because a person's context heavily influences how pleasing their actions are to God. Because what's pleasing to God is the heart, right? God looks at the heart. And for one person, the fathers will talk about two girls. Both girls were slaves. One was bought by a prostitute. The other one was bought by basically a nun. The one was raised in all virtue, knowing the good, following it, all of these kinds of things. The other was raised up to every kind of filth and twisted kind of love and all of this kind of stuff. And they say, do you really believe that these two girls are going to be judged the same way? Because their contexts are so different. So, for this girl, everything was handed on a platter. The level of will, the level of active love and moving towards God, very small, even though her life exterior looks much better. Whereas this girl, who wants to get out of that filth, but is trapped in addiction and trapped in an abusive situation and trapped in all these difficulties, the amount of love that she pours out to God to try to get out of that situation, to get out of those bad habits, might be 1,000 times more than this other. But exteriorly, her life may still look really bad, right? So we have to remember that the reality is, this is why he says this is a silent and invisible warfare. Because at the end of the day, the only judge of how a particular person is doing is God and that person, right? They're working together because the only person God is judging you by is the person he wants you to become and that you're capable of becoming. And he doesn't compare you to the person next to you because your characters are different, your genetics are different, your situations are different, your societal conditions are different. There's 100 different things. We couldn't even begin to calculate all of them in order to make an accurate comparison. Well, but God's capable, right? He knows all. So he's able to kind of do that. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look and praise the good things from the past, that we shouldn't desire for the return of them, and that we shouldn't encourage people in them. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of things we do that we can get on our high horse about and think we're so virtuous that we only do because it just happens to be a habit, not necessarily a good or a bad one, because we haven't particularly chosen it. We've just been doing it forever. And the whole point is to make these habits more intentional, right? And to choose God because He's good, because we want this, not just happen to fall into it. I mean, we should thank God every day that we've fallen into becoming Orthodox, being Orthodox. It is a blessing that not everyone has. And we shouldn't take that for granted. It should be an occasion, for thanking God and then responding with our whole heart. Yes, in the beginning, you just fell into it. Fine. Now show how much you appreciate it by beginning to make it intentional and showing how much you appreciate that God gave you this gift in an easier way than millions of people throughout the world who haven't had that opportunity, or who, by being swept away with the tide of the status quo around them, didn't sweep them into, but rather has swept them into all kinds of filth and destruction and heresy and all these kinds of things, right? We need to be more accountable because God has given us these things, not less. And God will judge that way as well, right? He'll say, look, the scriptures say, to those who more have been given, more will be expected, right? That's just the way it is. And so it's very difficult for us to turn and say, well, you live such a bad life, and back then my grandparents, well, they never got divorced. But you're letting your marriage fall apart. We can't judge people like that. We can't use those kind of exterior contexts to beat people over the head. That's not the point. I don't know, does that help a bit?
Absolutely. Papa, as always, we thank you for sharing these pearls with us, and this is a very, I think, pertinent topic, because oftentimes, at least for myself, when I hear the word ascetic, or we think about ascetic, we only think about somebody who eats locusts and honey and has a beard to the ground and whatnot. But the deeper asceticism, as you're suggesting tonight through these readings, is to dig within the soul and clean the inside of the cup, as our Lord tells us. So I personally want to thank on behalf of the Bookstore for you for sharing this with us. And unfortunately, we'll be according to our schedule. God's schedule is different, but according to our written schedule, we won't hear from you, God willing, until a month from now, if I'm not mistaken. We look forward to that advocacy until then.
Well, that gives you. Well, you won't have to look forward to it until then. This gives you a month. You got 5 chapters through, right? And the first one is just about making a start. So you got 4 chapters, and you got 4 weeks. Take 1 week and go do that chapter. Take real stock. Be real practical with yourself. See how you did, right? Real practical. The thing to remember is living in the world, living in our situation, we got lots of opportunities for practicing this in little ways. You're driving home, instead of putting on the radio, turn it off and say some prayers as you're driving home. Or, instead of, there's just a million ways that we can practice this in the little things and make a start. So I'll commend you. You got 4 weeks, all right? Make a chart and see how you do.
Okay, and you'll take stock, all right?
Well, yeah. Spiritually, we'll all take stock, but we won't be doing public confession next in 4 weeks' time. You won't be expected to, start confessing out loud. But very good. If there's no other questions, then
your closing prayers. Thank you.
O Christ, the true light, who doth enlighten and sanctify everyone that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the performance of thy commandments. By the intercessions of thine all immaculate Mother, and of all thy saints. Amen. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, the Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy on us and save us. Salve, everyone. Good struggle for putting these things into practice.